My eldest brother is a gangster. I took advantage of his amnesia and lied to him, saying that we were lovers. We did everything we should and shouldn't do. But anyone who dared to deceive him died. Now he has a gun to my head. 01. I didn't expect Franklin to recover his memory so quickly. To be honest, the scene was a bit chaotic. I was kneeling on his legs, with my white shirt hanging on my arm, halfway between taking it off. He wasn't much better. The collar of his shirt was wide open, and there were a few deep red marks on his neck. A moment ago, those eyes were filled with moist lust. The next moment, the look he gave me was so cold, as if he was looking at a dead person. If it were someone else, they would probably be trembling with fear. But I am different, I have an advantage. I'm not afraid of death. I maintained my smile, slowly raised my hands, and then slowly brought them together in front of my forehead. I gripped the barrel of the gun, feeling the cool touch of the metal spreading across my palm. Franklin did not fire the gun. I then took advantage of the situation and slowly moved the gun barrel from the forehead to the left chest. Franklin's eyes followed the moving barrel of the gun and fell on my chest. His Adam's apple rolled slightly. "Brother, hitting your head doesn't look good. Hit the heart. Let me die in your arms." Franklin didn't take my advice. His gun began to move downward. The cold muzzle of the gun crawled along my body like a snake. From top to bottom. Then from bottom to top. Finally crawled into my mouth. The barrel of the gun blocked my mouth and I was forced backward. The tide welled up in those eyes again. The gunman's deep, hoarse voice sounded. "One shot and he'll die? That's wishful thinking. Let me teach you. What is worse than death?" Franklin is such a mad dog. It was 3 days later when I woke up from the high fever. I sat up from the soft round bed. The room is decorated in a gorgeous and complicated way, and it is the master bedroom of Franklin Villa. It seems that he has really recovered his memory. In just 3 days, he returned to his own territory from the safe house in the deep mountains and forests. I got dressed and went downstairs. The villa was empty, with only the nanny there. I quickly drank 2 mouthfuls of vegetable porridge and went out. Maybe because Franklin had greeted me in advance, the guy at the door didn't follow me. I took out my cell phone only after we walked away. In the text box there was a small colorful advertisement sent from an unknown number. I called the number back. No one spoke after the call was connected. "It's me." After a pause of a few seconds, the call was hung up. A moment later, the phone received a second text message from this number. "Now, see you at the old place." I deleted it after reading it, then set off for the agreed location. 03. "Hey, long time no see, my dearest brother." In the dimly lit box, Felix sat among a group of scantily dressed women. When he saw me push the door open, he raised his glass to me in greeting. He motioned to the woman next to him to give up her seat, and waved for me to come over. As soon as I sat down, the man embraced me warmly and asked the beautiful women to serve me comfortably. I was immediately overwhelmed by the enthusiasm of the women. Someone had undone the buttons of his shirt, revealing a large area of his chest covered in scars. "Come on, Felix, I'm not here to play today." I stretched out my hand to push him away while gathering my clothes. Felix didn't say anything either, just watched with a smile as the women touched me all over. When he had seen enough, he finally spoke. All right, get out now, don't scare my dear brother." The women left reluctantly, acting coquettishly. The box fell silent. He lit a cigarette and blew a puff of smoke into my face. As he watched me button up my shirt, he said playfully, "So resistant? It's no good after being developed? Women can't even touch you." I moved away a little to put some distance between me and him. "Stop joking around, Felix. Let's get down to business." Felix smiled and puffed at me, then said, "Okay, I won't tease you anymore, let's get down to business." 04. This time, I sat on the sofa and talked with Felix. But last time, it was the same room. However, I was held down by his younger brothers and was kneeling on the ground with blood all over my face while I talked to him. At that time he laughed wildly, poured the wine over my head, and lifted my chin to force me to look at him. "I didn't expect that, brother. I thought you were a loyal dog beside Big Brother." So you would do bad things behind his back. He came close to me and said softly, "Little bad dog, bark twice for your brother to hear. If my brother is happy, I will let you go." I did respond to him, but my response was the four-character national quintessence. So later, he called me a dead dog and trampled on my head under his feet. I am a dog next to Franklin, and almost everyone in his family knows about this. But I was not a loyal dog. I secretly contacted Franklin's rivals without his knowledge. As a result, he was caught by Felix. With the evidence in his hand and a severe beating, I was finally forced to accept Felix's deal. The Wynn family has a batch of goods arriving from the sea and needs a contact person. Franklin was originally the designated contact person. But Felix wanted to take over this batch of goods and become the connector of this cargo route. The deal between Felix and me was an assassination attempt on Franklin. Franklin hit his head while escaping and temporarily lost some of his memory. But he was awesome. Not only did he survive the disaster, he also took me to the safe house. I stayed in the safe house for 3 months. 3 months. Enough for Felix to devour the entire batch en route. It's also enough for me to climb into my eldest brother's bed. 05. Cheers, my good brother. I wish our cooperation will go smoothly this time as well. Felix took it for granted that I would still cooperate with him. He raised his glass to me with great energy. But I waved my hand and didn't even take the drink. "Felix, you misunderstood. I came here this time to make things clear in person. Our partnership has come to an end." It's very interesting to watch people's faces change. Especially looking at Felix, he had a smile on his face one moment, and the next moment the smile was frozen. A face with all kinds of colors changed all over, like a clown. But he is indeed Franklin's biological brother. By the time his expression was right, his gun was against my forehead. Felix talked a lot, trying to coerce and bribe me into working for him again. But this time it's different, we're even. This time it was my turn to talk to him with a smile. "Felix, you and I both know that my brother's assassination does not stand up to further investigation. You seek profit, I seek life, now we are even. From now on, everyone will live in peace and keep their distance." Felix is an illegitimate son who came to the throne after his father's original wife died, and his position in the Wynn family is still unstable. So no matter how crazy he was afraid that his little actions behind the scenes would be known by his older brother Franklin or his father James. He stared at me sinisterly, put away his gun, and told me to get out. When I reached the door, he suddenly called me again. "Gary, you'll regret being Franklin's dog. He's a cold-blooded guy." Hale, the servant his mother left for him, who had served him for many years. He shot people in the head without blinking. How long do you think you can survive under his control? I smiled and left without saying anything. 06. I was in no hurry to go back, I just wandered around on the road. There was a black car in the distance, following me slowly for a long time. It's easy for me to get rid of the little tail. But I could probably guess who was in the car. That person must not be happy with me running away by myself. He only likes me when I'm obedient. So I turned on my phone and dialed a number. "Brother, are you here to pick me up? I'm lost. Can you take me home?" Little tricks like this can make Franklin happy. If he's happy, I'll feel better. Sitting in the passenger seat, I immediately took off the dagger tied to my calf. Franklin didn't even look at it and continued driving forward. I opened the car window a little and began to doze off in the cool night breeze. After a while, he suddenly said, "You have a good sense of anti-reconnaissance." I opened my eyes and looked at him. Under the light of the street lamp, the expression on the man's face was calm and indifferent. "Brother, if we weren't smart in our line of work, we would have been arrested by the police long ago." Still a calm response. Seeing that he stopped talking, I continued to close my eyes and doze off. But he closed the car window and said his fever had just subsided and asked me to stay out of the wind. It was almost midnight when we returned to Franklin's villa. After parking the car, he lit a cigarette, took a puff and then held it between his fingers. Franklin's facial features are very superior, especially now when he looks relaxed and decadent. He can probably charm a lot of men and women. He didn't get out of the car, so I stayed in it too. Seeing that I didn't move, he turned around and asked me what was wrong. I unbuttoned the first 2 buttons of my collar and answered, "Brother, I have done everything. It's time to give me a reward." He raised an eyebrow at me. I reached out and took the cigarette from between his fingers. "This cigarette will do." I gently took a sip of the place where he had sucked. He chuckled, took the cigarette from my mouth and leaned closer. "Is that enough?" His lips are very sexy. I also went over to him, grabbed his collar and made him lower his head. I said, "Maybe it's not enough." Then I kissed her. 07. We didn't take the next step that night. Franklin was called away again by his father James. I took a shower. Amid the mist, I looked up at the mirror. Looking at the face in the mirror, my thoughts wandered uncontrollably. 2 years ago, I was brought into the Wen family because of this face. James had a beautiful girlfriend in his early years, but she was short-lived and is no longer with us. And I am the son of that white moonlight. James adopted me as his son. From then on, I became the 3rd young master of the Wen family. But I didn't change my surname to Wen. One reason is that I am not James' biological son, and the other is that he thinks the name Gary sounds nice. He told me to keep this name for my mother. James even gained a reputation as a lovesick man because of this. Until I discovered his secret habit in his bedroom. Those group sex videos. The protagonists are mostly young men and women with good looks. The content is bloody, violent, and obscene. It reminds me of how James let me grow my hair long and how he always loved to touch my cheek. A chill ran through my body. James has a perverted desire for me. But I can't leave the Wen family yet. 08. The turning point happened when Franklin returned to China. He came back to take over some of James' domestic businesses. I looked at that cold and ascetic face and thought that this person would not be as perverted as old man Wen. At least it doesn't look disgusting. Compared to staying with a perverted old man, being a younger brother under Franklin is indeed a relatively better choice. So when I knelt before him, I expressed my loyalty to him with all my heart. I said that as long as Big Brother is willing to accept me, I would work like a slave for you. I will do whatever my elder brother tells me to do, without any hesitation. If he is willing to protect me, I would kowtow to him a few times immediately. But he just sneered. He pinched my face, looked down at me and asked, "You dare to do anything? Young master, think carefully. I am better than that old immortal. Even more perverted." 09. Franklin is telling the truth. He is indeed a pervert. The first day he got me from James, he locked me up in the torture room and hung me up. He pinched my neck, got close to my face, and asked in a low voice who I was. I was almost strangled to death, and I answered in a hoarse voice that my name was Gary. I was starving for oxygen and my head was about to explode. He let me go again and instead grabbed my neck from behind, pressing me towards him. He leaned over and whispered in my ear, saying, "You little imposter, just try to fool the old immortal. You can't live without lying to me." His dark eyes stared at me, and a chill ran down my spine to my heart. His next words made me feel like I was falling into an icy cave. "You know, Gary died a long time ago. I killed him with my own hands. Right here I stabbed him." His fingers gently drew circles on my left chest through my clothes. I opened my eyes wide and my body began to tremble uncontrollably. He seemed satisfied with my body's reaction. He let me go and turned to get a long, thick whip from the rack. He whispered to me, "My dear brother, guess now whether I will let you live or not." It was a long time later that my guess was confirmed. This torture was James's attempt to test my identity. Franklin was the executioner, and James sat in the dark room of the torture chamber, watching everything silently. If there is even the slightest flaw, I won't be able to get out of this room alive. At that time, it was the only way for me to survive. Just to make him believe that I really am Gary. And I can indeed prove it. I have an old scar on my left breast. I know all about Gary. I can tell you the whole story of the night Gary was assassinated. When Gary was 18 years old, he encountered an assassination attempt. The target was originally Gary's mother. But he was seen by Gary, who had just taken a temporary leave to go home. After escaping into a dead end, Gary was stabbed in the chest by the masked killer. In fact, even professionals would find it difficult to find flaws in what I said. I told almost 90% of the truth. And all my performances are carefully designed. But he wouldn't believe me so easily. He wanted to pry the flaw out of me. Franklin still tortured me in various ways. I was covered in blood and only had one breath left. He injected me with drugs before I fell into a coma, forcing me to wake up. He whispered in my ear and begged me to tell him the truth if it hurt me, and if he told me the truth he would stop torturing me. My spirit was on the verge of collapse. He shuffled all the questions and repeated them in a confusing manner. The sharp blade was pressed against my throat. If what I said doesn't make sense, I'll be covered in blood in the next second. He asked me again who I was. I spoke with difficulty and said my name was Gary. He kicked me hard in the abdomen. I was shaking like a sandbag. I thought he would continue, but he suddenly stopped, just watching me silently. The only sound in the dim torture chamber was my heavy breathing. Such a sudden pause made my tense nerves collapse in an instant. Then, the severe pain that had been deliberately suppressed broke out from all over his limbs. The pain was so severe that I saw stars and my ears were buzzing. The consciousness became uncontrollably confused. And just at this moment, his problem came again. He asked me if the person who saved me was Keith. He did it on purpose. He deliberately asked me when I was unconscious. This problem, so far, is the first time it has occurred. Moreover, this question is quite vicious. According to the informant's information, Gary was rescued by Keith, a man secretly sent by James. But in fact, the police received information that James released him personally. The real informant was killed before sending the message. At that time, Keith used an alias and told Gary that his name was Leo. 11. I have read the detailed information of the Wen family. In his early years, James was just a debt collector under boss Jiang. But Jiang Lao Da's only daughter fell in love with him. James has since risen to prominence. After boss Jiang's death, no one could suppress James anymore. He rose to power by stepping on the corpses of Jiang's family. Before the death of Jiang's only daughter, she sent someone to assassinate Gary's mother in revenge against James. When Bai Yueguang died, James went completely crazy. The bloody internal strife within the Wen family began. James was busy with his internal struggle and had no time to take care of Gary, so he sent Keith to accompany Gary. One is protection, the other is house arrest. Keith is from the Jiang family, but he has been with James for many years. James had Keith's support and caused the Jiang family to suffer a lot in internal strife. But there was an accident that time. James was ambushed and Keith had to leave Gary and go to rescue him. The Jiang family took the opportunity to come to the house and kidnap Gary. Gary's whereabouts have been unknown since then. It was pure coincidence that James saw Gary again. At that time, his men intercepted a batch of cargo on the high seas. And I am one of the goods. I had a very unfortunate experience. The Jiang family sold me to a fraud gang at a low price. Because my performance was so poor, I was almost sold off like a pig. As a result, she was favored by others because of her pretty face and became one of the products in this batch. Finally, by some strange coincidence, it returned to James' hands. But is it really that easy to believe what I say? He is not James anymore. He has always doubted my identity. I'm Gary. I even suspected that I was an undercover police officer. But he couldn't find any trace of my external contacts. Because from the moment I met James, I stopped contacting my upline. I'm waiting for this test. My answer still contains some truth. I said, the person who saved me was Leo. This answer kept me alive. But the torture had just begun. Franklin is a vengeful person. During the interrogation, I cursed at him in a delirious state. I roared at him, telling him to kill me if he had the guts, or I would definitely kill him. Because of this sentence, he decided to train me like a dog. When the interrogation was over, he reached out and gently wiped the blood off my face, smiling as he did so. There are so many people who want to kill me, you have to wait in line. But you're still pretty tough. I really want to know how long it takes for such a tough guy to be trained to become a dog. I really wanted to curse a few more times, but I didn't have the energy. My eyes went dark and I completely passed out. 15. Franklin has many different ways of training dogs. When I was most upset, I even suspected that I had really become a dog wagging its tail to beg for food. One day, he suddenly had an idea and said he wanted to take me out to broaden my horizons. We went into the mountains. There is a wasteland covered with weeds in the mountains. He asked me if I knew where this place was. Seeing that I was confused, he laughed softly and then told me, "This is a wild cemetery. Inside are traitors who were buried alive by the one family." I was so shocked that I was speechless for a moment and just stared at the lush vegetation on the ground. I thought to myself, this is too fucking outrageous. He added, "Do you really think there's someone buried down there? I was just teasing you." I was about to withdraw my shocked expression, but he continued calmly. "How could a traitor of the Wen family be treated so well? A traitor is only worthy of chop it up and feed it to the dogs, or cut it into pieces and throw it into the sea to feed the fish." This time he ignored my reaction. He pulled the dog leash and continued walking forward. No conversation along the way, until a small mound of earth appeared in front of the road. In front of the mound, there is a small nameplate. Franklin took me over and said, "Come and see your savior. The owner of this grave is Keith." Franklin said that Keith was originally a servant brought by his mother from the Jiang family, but secretly he became a dog for James. As he spoke, he lit a cigarette and stuck it into the soil in front of the grave. Blue-gray smoke came out of the cigarette and dispersed when the wind blew. But dogs that don't obey their masters don't live long. Franklin told me that after Keith supported James to become the boss, he also had his own ideas. He was no longer content to be just a dog. He began to disobey James' orders. Do you know how he died? Franklin raised his chin slightly towards me, and I was forced to my knees by his minions. He picked up the gun and released the safety catch. The muzzle of the gun was pointed at my forehead. Just like this. Bang! A gunshot rang out. His head just exploded. The flying bullet grazed my temple in an instant. Not long after the shot, everyone in the Wen family knew something. Franklin successfully trained another obedient dog. 16. After returning from the safe house, Franklin let me move into his villa. Our relationship became ambiguous. During the day I am still his follower. The night did not stop. But he doesn't return to the villa often. When he's not around, I sleep in the guest room. The same thing happened tonight. However, I was woken up in the middle of the night. Franklin is back. The noise wasn't actually that loud, but I'm a very light sleeper. He was talking to his confidant downstairs, and I was eavesdropping through the door. After listening for a long time without hearing anything important, I went back to bed in boredom. I started pretending to sleep. I knew he would come to me on his own. Half an hour later, he opened the door to my room. Soon, the aroma of shower gel filled the air. Something warm and wet touched my lips gently. I didn't move and continued to pretend to be asleep. That man was very patient, but also very mean. A hand ran down my cheek, then slowly passed through the neck. Finally stopped at the clavicle. Fingers with thin calluses lingered there. A little itchy. He suddenly leaned close to my ear. The hot air I exhaled sprayed up and my ears began to feel hot. "Little fool." He snorted smugly. "Do you still want to pretend?" I opened my eyes, stretched out my right hand to push him, and complained that he was disturbing my sleep. But he grabbed my wrist. He said that naughty puppies should be punished. I saw the belt he was holding in his other hand. So I obediently stretched out my left hand. I said, "Brother, then punish me." His eyes were dark and the smile on his face grew. I thought he was going to tie my hands. But he didn't. He said in a hoarse voice, "No tying of hands tonight. I want to watch it tonight. A puppy with its legs tied up. What should I do?" 17. The night is long. The night wind blew away the window screens, and the deep blue skies slowly unfolded. Starry sky. I looked at them, and thousands of stars swayed and entered my eyes. The whole world seemed to fall into a turbulent sea of stars. The waves surged, I was lifted up high and then dropped heavily. I think I'm going to drown in this ocean. But someone wouldn't let me go. He kissed the back of my neck and gagged me in a wicked way. He said, "Beg me and I will let you go." But I know it's useless to ask him. Franklin is a liar. He likes to trick people into begging him and then torture them even more severely. I've experienced what it was like in the safe house for 3 months. I turned my head away and called him a liar. He covered my mouth with his hand and whispered to me, telling me to be a good puppy and not to swear. As the tears fell, he pulled me into his arms and hugged me tightly. Warm breath sprayed rapidly on my earlobe. He asked me in a low voice if I was going to die. I bit my lower lip, unwilling to respond to him. At this moment, my soul is struggling in the abyss. I am going to die. Die painfully. People's feelings are sometimes confused and distorted. The physical pleasure is accompanied by hundreds or thousands of times more mental pain. Joy and pain are both torture. Eventually it drives people crazy or leads to destruction. But I can't turn back. I can only go down this path until the end. 19. I worked under Franklin and started out as a watchdog. At the beginning, he threw me into a deserted place and asked me to guard the gate. It takes half a year to lose it. I worked as a watchdog obediently for half a year. He was very satisfied. So he promoted me to be his follower. But he always just let me do odd jobs, and the people and things I could come into contact with were limited. My original plan was to work my way up from being a follower. Work hard to become a trusted confidant. I didn't expect that the path would deviate so seriously. After hanging out with him for a while, I kind of figured out that Franklin wasn't attracted to women. But the first time I realized something was wrong was the night his new nightclub opened. A thin young boy sat on his lap. The boy drank half a glass of wine, and his fair face gradually turned red, as delicate as a flower bud covered with dew. He hugged Franklin with a dazed look and asked for a kiss. Franklin smiled and grabbed the boy's neck, kissing him passionately. Like the other little brothers, I stood quietly in the dark corner as a background. Franklin suddenly opened his eyes. He was still kissing someone passionately. There was no trace of intoxication in his eyes. Those eyes were slightly narrowed, and the gaze they cast revealed undisguised aggression and possessiveness. Like a predator waiting for an opportunity, it is staring at its prey and slowly revealing its sharp fangs. I shifted my position tentatively. His eyes were still fixed on me. I stopped and continued to serve as a background board with an expressionless face. But my palms were soaked with cold sweat. I realized that the targeted prey seemed to be me. 20. To be honest, I secretly prepared myself mentally for a long time. I even thought about what I would do if Franklin tried to force me. In the end, he came to nothing. What comes is another matter. The Wynn family's goods from the sea are about to arrive. This batch of goods is very important to the Wynn family, as it is linked to many of James' important domestic businesses. It is also important to our plans, because the person who takes over this batch of goods needs to stay in the country for at least 1 year. My task at that time was to gather information and act accordingly. James originally designated Franklin to take over, but Felix wanted it too. Unexpectedly, Franklin took the initiative to give up the goods and the route. I guessed at the time that he was probably setting a trap so that he could trick Felix badly in the future. Otherwise, Felix would be dragged into the fight. In this way, if James wanted to use his son as a scapegoat before running away, it would not be so easy. In fact, there is another possibility. But it was so ridiculous that I didn't think too deeply about it at the time. Franklin's plan was for me to pretend to betray him. He asked me to contact the rival company and let Felix find out. Felix really can't beat his older brother. Almost everything that happened afterwards happened according to Franklin's plan. Just a little surprise. That means he has lost his memory. 21. After losing his memory, Franklin misunderstood our relationship. But this is an opportunity for a big gamble. Time is precious. I can't always be a handyman. The moment he hugged me from behind, I made my decision. I misled him and let everything happen. It also started from this decision. Every day that followed, I watched myself rot inch by inch with great clarity. But what can we do? I can't go back. 22. The sky outside the window was already turning pale. Franklin was sitting on the sofa by the window, holding a cigarette. He was shirtless, his muscular body covered in tattoos. It spreads from the chest all the way to the back of the waist. Under the tattoo, there are many old scars interlaced. I reached out my hand and stroked along the end of the tattoo, inch by inch, until I touched his heart. The skin there is smooth and unmarked. Then he held my hand. When I tried to look him in the eye, he exhaled a puff of smoke. The face was hidden behind the blue-gray smoke. It doesn't seem real. I asked him in a low voice, "Brother, what is our relationship now?" He continued smoking and did not speak. But he always faced me. It seemed to be staring at me through the smoke. This gave me a slight illusion, as if the person in front of me was an old friend. He suddenly answered my question. "That's the kind of relationship you want." And at this moment, the smoke just dissipated. But he turned his head and stopped looking at me. 23. With this relationship, life becomes much easier. Franklin didn't say it, but he became more and more fond of me. I have access to more and more things. I sent out intelligence more frequently. It's clearly a matter of licking blood from a knife. But it went very smoothly. It went so smoothly that it made people feel a chill down their spine. I had a vague feeling that something was going to happen. And not long after, something really happened. The main reason why James still dared to stay in the country was that the police had not yet obtained the key evidence that could uproot the Wynn family and its protection umbrella and industrial chain. This insidious and cunning old fox does have some skills. But his son is not so good. This time it was Felix who got into trouble. Felix is too greedy. But he does things uncleanly. This time he was finally caught by the tail. James is just as cruel to his own son. Felix was beaten beyond recognition. His head and face were covered in blood. He crawled to James' feet and kowtowed desperately, begging his father to spare his life. He said that this time some policemen had sneaked in. He can find the police, and he wants to exchange the police's life for his own. 2 rats that sneaked into the Wynn family. He paused to take a deep breath, then suddenly turned his head. The bloody face was looking straight at Franklin and me behind him. Felix spat out a mouthful of blood foam and continued. "One of them, he's hiding next to Big Brother." 24. In fact, even I don't know how many undercover agents have infiltrated the Wynn family. Undercover identities are kept highly confidential. After all, one move can affect the whole situation, and we only contact our own superiors. I'm not sure if I've been exposed, but running away at this time would be unwise. First, the Wynn family was watching too closely, so it was basically impossible for him to escape. Second, it is easy to be exposed actively. I can only take a gamble. Fortunately, a lot of important information was sent out in the early stages. If I really get caught, it's not a loss. 25. So, the Wynn family arrested 2 people. One of them was Franklin's driver. When James let me through, the 2 had already been tortured. He beckoned me to come over to him. I had no choice but to walk towards him on the bloody ground. He hugged me, pointed at the 2 bloody men on the ground, and asked me if I was afraid. In fact, they no longer have human form. The limbs are twisted and folded abnormally. But perhaps because they were drugged, they were still awake. Felix sat in a wheelchair, grinning as he poked one of the men's lower limbs with an iron rod. Franklin stood not far away, watching everything coldly. I just felt my heart tighten and my throat dry. I wish I could kill the beast next to me right now. But I can't. I could only try my best to act scared. James slid his fingers along my cheek, leaned close to me, and whispered in my ear, "You look just like your mother when you're scared. Like a little rabbit. It makes people feel pity." He picked up a glass of wine and asked me to drink it. Dark red wine in the glass. Like blood on the ground. He wasn't consulting with me. The glass of wine was pressed against my lips and the entire glass of wine was poured into my mouth. I choked and coughed violently, but he burst out laughing. He praised me for being a good and obedient child and said he would take me to see the world. James wanted me to see how he executed the 2 men. I was taken to the dog park. It was filled with hungry and ferocious dogs. Then I realized that what Franklin said was not a joke. People were thrown in. It was like a piece of bread falling apart easily. James asked his men to hold me. I was forced to watch the whole thing. He sat aside, admiring my expression with interest. When it was over, his men let me go. My legs went weak and I fell straight to my knees. The smell of blood rushed into my nose like crazy, irritating me to the point of vomiting. Blood rushed to his temples. Amid the severe tinnitus, I heard James speaking. He was very proud. This, he said, was what happened if you went against him. What a fucking fuck. Later, James left with his men. I knelt on the ground and vomited so much that I couldn't get up. Until the thunder struck and I was drenched in heavy rain. Only then can tears mix with the rain and fall. 26. After being caught in the rain, I developed a high fever. I lay on the bed like a dead dog, limp and drowsy. Once you fall asleep, you will fall into a chaotic dream. I dreamed about a day in middle school. At that time, my parents died and I was taken to my uncle's house. The death of my parents was such a huge blow that I was depressed all day. I learned to skip classes, fight, and smoke. I am just like any bad kid. I skipped class again that day. It all started when my head teacher asked me to talk to him. In fact, she didn't have any bad intentions, it's just that what she said irritated me. She asked me, "Am I doing this to my parents every day?" She knows nothing. My parents didn't care about me at all before. They always say they are busy. I know they are very busy catching bad guys all over the world. Later they died. I was left behind by them. I hid on the rooftop of the teaching building and smoked. The afternoon sun was still scorching, making my eyes almost tear up. I squinted and looked downstairs. It was quiet downstairs with no one there. If you jump down at this time, it may take a long time before it is discovered. I laughed at myself twice, but when I turned around I was shocked. The squad leader stood behind me. I don't know how long this guy stood there without saying a word. It really scared me to death. "What are you doing?" "You scared me," I asked him unhappily. In fact, he is not only my class monitor, but also the child of my uncle's neighbor. We were not familiar with each other at first, but we became a little more familiar with each other after becoming neighbors. He didn't answer my question. He just sat down facing me and took out a pack of cigarettes from his school trousers pocket. It's a brand I haven't smoked before. He skillfully took out a cigarette, lit it, and then put it directly into his mouth. As I looked at him in surprise, he handed me the cigarette box and asked me if I wanted one. I didn't hesitate and just took one and started smoking too. His cigarettes are better than mine. I asked him while smoking, "Good students also smoke?" He smiled and said he was just relaxing. We stayed on the rooftop until school was over that day. In the warm light of the setting sun, he asked me if I wanted to go to his house for dinner. Before I could answer, he suddenly put his arms around me again. He said, "Come on, come home with me." 27. We just get along in this inexplicable way. He is an interesting person too. He didn't report me for skipping classes, and he even skipped classes with me. We spent most of our time smoking on the rooftop. No chatting, just sitting face to face. Sometimes I looked at him and found that he was also looking at me through the smoke. I tease him occasionally. "Why are you staring at me all the time? Am I so handsome that I charmed you?" He just smiled, neither admitting nor refuting. In fact, he is very handsome, especially when he smiles. If I were a girl, I would definitely chase him. 28. Later, I don't know when it started, but we became closer. Maybe it's because he smoked enough cigarettes with me. It may also be because he has watched too many sunsets with me on the rooftop. Or maybe it's because the food in his house is delicious and his mother is very kind and caring to me. Gradually, we became inseparable. I am willing to listen to him and start studying hard and living a good life. My uncle thanked him and said it was a good thing he was there, otherwise no one would be able to control me. Actually, my uncle was wrong. It's not him who controls me. It was he who saved me. He saved me twice. The first time was on the rooftop. The second time was in the alley. That night my fever reached over 39 degrees Celsius and I almost died of burns. My uncle went out on a mission half a month ago, and no one at home takes care of me. The monitor took me to the school hospital to get medicine and then asked for leave to take me home. He thought he could leave me at his house and have his mother help take care of me. I thought so too. None of us expected that we would be fleeing in a dark and narrow alley that night. I was dizzy and was dragged by him to run wildly in the dark, until a trash can appears in front of you. My consciousness suddenly became clear in the dream. I wanted to break free from his hands and stop him from doing the next move. I wanted to yell his name, but I couldn't shout. I have received a lot of special training, including dream awareness training. I can no longer call out his name in my dreams. I can only watch everything happen again in my dreams. And he will be just as recorded in the files. Knock me out and stuff me in the trash can. Then he turned around and led away the pursuers. Finally, he ran into a dead end and was stabbed in the chest. 29. When I woke up, it was already evening. I opened my eyes in a cold sweat and found someone sitting beside my bed. It's Franklin. I didn't expect him to come and take care of me. He was even caring, meticulous and considerate. But this feeling is strange. It was like a last meal before the guillotine. We spent almost a week in this weird atmosphere. Until the day I fully recover. He suddenly said he wanted to give me a gift. A small wooden peace plaque. When he put the peace amulet around my neck, he squeezed my shoulder. He said I had a weak constitution and was always sick. I thought to myself, what's the big deal about being sick? In a place like this where people are eaten by humans, it's good enough to be alive. We stood in front of the mirror and looked at the people in the mirror standing side by side. He asked me if I liked the gift. I said I like anything he gives me. He smiled and praised me for my sweet talk. Then he looked me in the eyes and said seriously, "Take a closer look. I asked for it specifically for you. I hope you will be safe from now on." 30. As soon as Franklin left, I received 2 messages. A piece of good news. A piece of bad news. The good news is that a deep dive informant has found key evidence and is trying to send it out. The bad news is that James ran away. The exact location is unknown, but it is likely still within the country. But he specifically wanted to flee abroad. According to the original plan, James would be arrested once key evidence was received. Under the current situation, we can only settle for the second best, first obtain evidence, and then find a way to take the next step. But even though James ran away, his trusted subordinates are still there. It is not easy for an informant to hand over evidence to the police. If you want to send letters to others, you need a relatively free identity. So it wasn't long before I received a new task: contact with the informant and deliver key evidence. In order to ensure the safety of evidence, only my identity will be disclosed during the mission. The identity of the informant is kept highly confidential. In other words, even if the mission information is intercepted by the Wen family, the evidence will not fall into the hands of others. Only if I go there in person will the informant appear. The agreed date is approaching. I counted the days silently. And when there was only 1 day left until the agreed date, something unexpected happened. James, who escaped, returned secretly. 31. After a forced body search and injection of drugs, I was taken to James' secret residence. And there, I met an acquaintance. That's a surprise, Gary. Oh no, you're not Gary, you're an imposter. At this time, my hands were tied, for 5 guns were pointed at my head, and I was kneeling on the ground. James sat in the main seat and looked at me with a smile. And the woman beside him? "It's my upline, Susan." "What's his name?" James smiled and hugged Susan. The woman leaned over intimately and whispered to him, "Oh, I remember now. Stephen. You are really young and promising, Stephen." There is no doubt that my identity and mission information were all exposed. No good end will be waiting for me. There's nothing to pretend about then. I spoke to James quite rudely and even asked about his ancestors. James wasn't annoyed either. He motioned to his men to put away the guns pointed at my head and said, "I shouldn't have let you leave me in the first place. It's all right now, I've been following these 2 brothers' mischief for too long. The quality has dropped." After saying that, he smiled and looked at the 2 brothers of the Wen family sitting on both sides. Franklin sat on James' left side, still with a sullen look on his face. On the other side, Felix, although with a plaster leg, couldn't hide the excitement of watching the show on his face. I ignored James and turned to ask Susan why. The woman glanced at me and told me unhappily that she originally belonged to James. My face must look very ugly. James, who had been staring at me, smiled even more happily. Susan is a smart person. She knows that she will have a better future if she follows me. Stephen, I admire you. If you are willing to follow me, then I won't care about what happened before. James tried to turn me over, but he only received abuse from me. His men tried to silence me, but he raised his hand to stop them. He kept me spitting out swear words for 10 minutes straight. Then he pulled out his phone and showed me a video. The video shows a middle-aged policeman walking on the road with a calm expression. Do you know him? Do you know how many ways I have to make him disappear? Want to see it for yourself, Stephen? James finally saw the expression he wanted on my face. He laughed wildly and wantonly. He knew he was going to succeed, because the person in the video is my only living relative. That's my uncle. 32. James asked me to continue contacting the informant. He wanted to use me as bait to lure out this informant. According to the information Susan stole from the bureau, the informant's confidentiality level was extremely high, and even she could not decipher his specific identity. But this informant has been lurking around James for a long time. An informant who lurks so deeply can even obtain key evidence. James was so angry that his teeth were itching. This time he vowed to catch this man himself. 33. The address left by the informant was an abandoned warehouse. James had already sent people to investigate. An hour before the agreed time, James and his men arrived near the warehouse. The sun had long since set, and the woods near the warehouse were dark and eerie. James' convoy was hidden in this woods. Time is gradually approaching. With half an hour left, I was taken off the bus. James signaled his men to remove my handcuffs and leg cuffs. Then he put his arm around my shoulders and whispered in my ear intimately. Just a reminder, Stephen. Don't try to be clever. Otherwise, I don't mind letting you explode into fireworks halfway. He held the remote control in front of my eyes and waved it, warning me of the consequences of disobeying him. James strapped a bomb and a bug to me. He will monitor my movements at all times. If I didn't obey, he would just move his fingers and I would be blown to pieces. Cold sweat oozed from my palms. I clenched my back teeth unconsciously. James finished speaking. The surroundings became quiet again. In the silent darkness, there was only the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional sound of the children walking nearby. I began to count the time silently in my heart. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. The last 20 minutes before the agreed time have arrived. I looked up at the warehouse in the distance. There was a lamp hanging on the door of the warehouse, which was flickering at this moment, becoming the only source of light in the darkness. James raised his hand and pointed to the warehouse, silently signaling me to go to the warehouse. I nodded, took a step forward, and walked forward obediently. The overgrown dirt road is difficult to walk on. Too dark and hard to see. I walked tremblingly. I slip every 3 steps. I hadn't walked far when I suddenly cried out, "Ouch!" Then he lost his balance and fell to the ground. James and his confidants immediately focused their attention on me. And in just over a second of space, a huge change happened in an instant. "Don't move! Police!" Someone grabbed James' neck from behind and a gun was pressed against his temple. James was immediately held hostage by 3 gunmen. On the left is Susan, and on the right is a male undercover police officer. The person who locked him from behind was Franklin. 34. The dark forest was illuminated by red and blue flashing police lights from all directions, and it was instantly as bright as day. James and his criminal gang were finally caught. James had no idea. The so-called informant contact mission was actually a trap set up to lure him out. When Felix got into trouble, I actually had some credit for it. The purpose is to create opportunities for informants. When the one family's attention shifted to Felix, the informant took the opportunity to secretly send out key evidence. Next, the arrest operation begins. But James sensed something unusual when Felix got into trouble. He escaped early. At that time, my identity was on the verge of being exposed. James has arranged for his trusted men to intensify surveillance on me. After several considerations, the plan was adjusted. We performed a big drama right under James' nose. The 2 pieces of information, good and bad, as well as the mission plan that I received, were eventually secretly captured by James' men. But that was all planned, including Susan's false betrayal. All this was just to confuse James and make him mistakenly believe that everything was under his control. In fact, the real mission information is hidden in the wooden piece card that Franklin gave me. Under the strict surveillance of the Wen family, my superiors cannot pass on the real news directly to me. It can only be passed on to me by someone else. To be honest, I have speculated about Franklin's identity. But when he quickly drew the contact symbol between me and my superior on my shoulder, I was indeed shocked. What I didn't expect was the informant with a very high level of confidentiality, who lurked around James for a long time and finally obtained key evidence, was actually two people. One is Keith, who has already died. The second is Franklin. However, Franklin was just his identity when he infiltrated the Wen family. His real name, it's Gary. 35. Extra, Gary. Gary sneaked into the Wen family using the identity of James' eldest son Franklin. And all this was the work of old informant Keith. Keith was an informant who infiltrated during the time of Boss Jiang. He is meticulous and his plans are complex, and one thing leads to another. The so-called Jiang family kidnapping Gary was actually a trap set by him. The purpose was to let Gary go right under James' nose. Only then will there be enough time to prepare for Gary's change of identity. But after staying in the quagmire for too long, it's hard not to do something unavoidable. Not long after, Gary changed his appearance and sneaked into the Wen family under the identity of Franklin. James caught an undercover police officer. He tortured the young policeman until he was barely alive. Then he handed the gun to Keith. James asked Keith to be the executioner who fired the final shot. At that time, Gary was brought with James. He saw Keith holding a cigarette, took the gun with a smile, and responded to James. "Thank you for your trust, big brother." Keith had a steady hand and fired one shot, sending red and white particles splattering. After that, Gary suffered from insomnia for half a month. As soon as I closed my eyes, I saw the face of the young policeman. Keith reminded him to adjust his state in time. The gray-haired old informant stood side by side with him on the weed-covered hillside. The setting sun in the distance was blood red, and the red light made people's eyes hurt. Everyone who has embarked on this path knows what the worst possible outcome will be. Don't forget who you are. If one day you want to shoot me, remember not to shake your hands. 36. Extra, Gary. Gary thought that taking on Franklin's identity was crazy enough. I didn't expect there would be a second one so crazy. There's a new undercover agent. The face used is still his old one. But James is skeptical about the identity of this new Gary. So a torture was arranged. Gary was actually nervous during the torture. He was afraid that his brother who was being tortured might say something wrong. I'm also afraid of exposing myself. After all, he and his tortured brother were both imposters. When James directed him to ask the last question, his heart was in his throat. The detail that Keith used the alias Leo was actually given away by him. Fortunately, the brother who was tortured gave the correct answer. He finally breathed a sigh of relief. James let down his guard for the moment. He took this opportunity to bring these shell brothers to his side. This is also what the Bureau means. His identity is too important, so he cannot take the initiative to reveal it. But he needs to try his best to get this set of shell brothers into his own hands. As for the true identity of Brother Tauka, I recognized him later from some of his small movements when he was smoking. The shell brother is his closest friend, Stephen. For a long time in middle school, he and Stephen were inseparable. Stephen thought their close relationship started from the day they smoked on the rooftop. Actually earlier. At that time, he was not Stephen's monitor, and they were not even in the same class. He's just a new transfer student. When the senior thugs cornered him in the alley and beat him up, Stephen, who was passing by, rushed in with a brick and saved him. They supported each other and walked to the entrance of the alley, where the street lights just came on. My parents told me to do more good things and help the weak. It's not that you're weak, brother, you're quite capable of fighting. But I'm doing good things, right? Under the warm yellow street light, the boy's big-toothed smile was imprinted in Gary's heart. 37. Extra, Gary. James is a pervert. This was the third time he took advantage of being drunk to ask Gary for someone. He was still thinking about the face Stephen had. Gary refused coldly. James asked ambiguously, "But are you attracted to him?" Gary knew James' temper. He just likes that and won't give up until he gets it. Gary is still thinking about how to deal with it. James suddenly said, "Well, if you really like it, it's yours." Gary pondered for a long time, repeatedly trying to figure out what James meant. But it is an opportunity. Gary has been trying to find a way to get Stephen up the ladder as quickly as possible. This is probably the only way to climb up in a short time without arousing James' suspicion. At first, Gary just wanted to pretend and didn't want to have sex. But the development of things was beyond his expectations. When the Wen family's goods from the sea arrived, Gary directed and acted in this play himself just to keep Felix in the country so that he could wipe out the Wen family in the future. He was pretending to have amnesia. The safe house has real-time surveillance that leads directly to James' secret room. If Gary wants to play the whole role, he has to pretend to have amnesia. The time for handing over the goods was tight, and James had no time to go to the safe house deep in the mountains and forests to find him. In the end, Felix had no choice but to take over. While the Wen family was busy dealing with this batch of goods, he just had to pretend for James. However, he didn't expect that Stephen would really take it seriously. 38. Extra. Gary. Gary felt that his thinking had seriously deteriorated. This is what caused things to get out of control. But at certain secret moments, he felt a sense of joy that was difficult to express. Certain emotions that have never been expressed have been lingering in my heart for too long. But that day, Stephen cried in his arms. These secret joys turned into sorrow. Stephen knows nothing. Don't know who he is. I don't know his unspoken feelings. He didn't even dare to think about what kind of situation he and Stephen would be in when the truth came out. 39. After everything was settled, the Bureau arranged psychological counseling for Gary, me, and several other colleagues. Actually, I'm fine. After going there a few times, I feel like I'm basically a normal person. But Gary seemed serious. The main thing is that he always avoids me. Until this day, I finally managed to catch him with great effort. I pulled him up to the rooftop. After many years, we smoked face to face again. He is very silent. He didn't even dare to look me in the eye. I asked him, "Brother, don't you have anything to tell me?" I reached up and lifted his face so that he was looking at me. He struggled a little, but I held on to him. He finally lost. After sighing, he finally spoke to me. He talked to me for a long time. Talk about what he did in the Wen family. Confess his thoughts. But mostly I was apologizing. Apologize for what he did to me in the Wen family. Apologize for his secret thoughts. Seeing how cautious he was, I felt uncomfortable. He was the sunshine of my youth. It shouldn't be like this between us. I interrupted his apology. Then I held his hand and told him I didn't blame him. His hands were shaking slightly. Later, he carefully considered his words and asked me with some stammering what our relationship would be in the future. I suddenly remembered my 18th birthday. He took me out of school for a big meal. We encountered a heavy rain on the way back, but we didn't bring an umbrella. So we just squeezed under one coat and rushed into the teaching building in the rain. After entering the building, he looked at me, panting. Suddenly asked, "Stephen, what will our relationship be like in the future? It's still like this? Holding a piece of clothing to keep out the rain?" At that time, I was stunned by his inexplicable question. But I answered him anyway. I said, "Of course, we want to be good brothers for life." Actually, I lied that day. I don't want to be just a brother to him. And now I decided to tell him this secret. I took the initiative to hug him. I told him that everything that happened in the past was out of necessity. But because it's him, I won't feel bad anymore. I don't blame him, I love him too. Before I could finish my words, he reached out and hugged me back tightly. At this moment, I knew that my son was back.